Well, joining me now to have a further look at this morning's papers is Albie Amankona, political commentator and co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism. Morning, Albie.
Good morning, James.
Let's start with the big story of the day. Rishi Sunak's really tough week. He's appearing before the COVID inquiry today. We'll come on to that in a moment. But let's start with the Rwanda situation. In the Times this morning, there's the headline, Ministers in frantic 48-hour race to save Rwanda bill from defeat. I mean, it's interesting. Despite the Conservatives' relatively large majority, it only takes less than 30 MPs to vote against the government for them to lose tomorrow. Do you think that could happen?
I think it's a distinct possibility. I believe Rishi Sunak actually lost his first Commons vote, I think it was last week or the week before, about the infected blood scandal. So obviously Tory MPs at the moment maybe have some form for a rebellion. But the question is whether or not they buy the line, which is appearing this morning in the Times that we're talking about today, that 99.5% of the migrants who are being sent to Rwanda would have their appeals thrown out of court and they'd be sent, and they've got to provide this really quite strong evidence that they face danger if they go to Rwanda. I think it's a distinct possibility that he could lose the vote when we look at the kinds of the groups, the factions within the Conservative Party who are up in arms over this. It's not just the right-wing factions, whether or not that's the Common Sense group led by Sir John Hayes or the New Conservatives led by Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates. It's also, on the other side of the party, the One Nation caucus, which is actually the biggest caucus in the party, over 100 MPs, led by Damien Green, the former Deputy Prime Minister under Theresa May, who are also hinting that they might not vote for this legislation. They're having a meeting today to discuss whether or not they're going to vote for the legislation. So he's really facing the pressure on all sides of the Conservative Party. And the question is, will he get his legislation through, or won't he get his legislation through?
I think it's really interesting, Albie, how the One Nation caucus is starting to throw its weight around a bit more, because, as you mentioned, it's got a very significant, percentage of the Conservative Parliamentary Party in it. And yet, historically, we think of pressure being put on prime ministers by the right of the party, particularly groups like the ERG and now the Conservative Growth Group that Liz Truss has started. Do you think it's right that the One Nation caucus is trying to exert its influence a bit more?
I think it's absolutely right that the One Nation caucus is trying to exert its influence even more. I note that they hired the comms director of the former London mayoral candidate Samuel Kasumu's campaign, and they have been a lot more active in the media and being a lot more forthright with their thoughts, which I think can only be a good thing. Being someone perhaps on the One Nation wing of the Conservative Party, I've always found it very frustrating that the right seems to be very organised, very open with how they feel, whereas the moderates are a little bit more loyal and quiet, which can both be a good thing and a bad thing. And I think the bad thing is that it means that actually it can just look like the only people that have any influence in the Conservative Party are these more organised right-wing groups such as the ERG in the past. The One Nationers weren't doing very much back then. Maybe they've taken a leaf out of the right-wingers' book, and I think that can only be a good thing.
The problem is, if you're the public and you hear any party talking about its various different factions, One Nation, Red Wall, Conservative Growth Group, ERG, the New Conservatives, I mean, I lose track, to be honest, Albie. If you're the public hearing that, you just think, well, you're a disunited party. And divided parties don't win elections, do they?
James, there's no point in pretending the Conservative Party isn't divided at the moment. The Conservative Party is very divided at the moment, and that is the problem. I want this legislation to succeed. It seems to me like a sensible solution to an insolvable problem. But perhaps the bigger problem is with the Rwanda scheme itself. I have supported the Rwanda scheme in the past. I want the scheme to succeed. But perhaps this was just the wrong thing from the beginning, and it was never really going to work. You heard Dominic Cummings last week saying that it was a gimmick. It was never actually supposed to work. And maybe he's right. And maybe we are just suffering the consequences of this bad policy brought forward by Boris Johnson's government.
Meanwhile, there's a story in the Times today under the headline, Red Wall MPs regret ousting Johnson amid comeback speculation. I mean, Albie, is there any question to which Boris Johnson making a comeback is the answer?
No, absolutely not. I think when people talk about Boris Johnson making a comeback and these Red Wall MPs, like my GB News colleague Lee Anderson, saying that he regrets calling for Boris Johnson to resign, I just think they're absolutely bonkers. I mean, pretty much every single problem that the Conservative Party is in at the moment was caused by Boris Johnson. Inflation was caused by lockdown and quantitative easing. The immigration crisis was caused by the Rwanda plan, which might have been unworkable from the beginning, and Boris Johnson and Priti Patel themselves liberalising the immigration rules after Brexit. And now we've got almost 750,000 people coming to the country each year. The problem with the types of politicians who are at the top of the Conservative Party, lots of them, in my opinion, political lightweights, are because Boris Johnson over-promoted political lightweights during his time in office. So I can see absolutely no problem to which Boris Johnson is the answer to the question. I thank him for what he did in 2019. That majority was a wonderful thing to do, but it was squandered after that. So thanks for 2019, Boris, but nothing after that.
Morning to Lisa, who's text on 87222, starting her message with the word Times, saying, the Prime Minister has made himself a hostage to fortune over Rwanda and that ridiculous stop the boat slogan. It's a classic example of trying to please all and pleasing nobody. He should have stood up to the right-wing zealot and shown authority and leadership from the start. Meanwhile, Albie, interesting story inside the Times this morning. Some YouGov polling for the Times about how the public perceives Rishi Sunak's handling of the pandemic. Of course, he was Chancellor at the time. He's before the COVID inquiry today. And it finds that more than half, 52% of those surveyed, now think that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which Sunak was behind, was a bad idea. And also, I mean, even furlough, which you think of as the one policy intervention that was almost universally popular during the pandemic, even then, only 35% say that Sunak gave about the right amount of financial support. 23% say it was too costly. 24% say he didn't go far enough. Do you think that's fair?
No, I don't think it's really fair. And I think this focus on personalities during the COVID inquiry is actually really unhelpful. Were there mistakes that Rishi Sunak made? Obviously. Look, I think, looking back, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was a bad idea with hindsight. But at the time, I thought it was a good idea. And I would imagine a lot of the public polled for this polling were probably in a similar position. I thought the furlough scheme was a brilliant idea at the time. Now I look back and I think, well, maybe we could have tweaked it so it didn't quite cost as much. So I might fall in that scheme, in that pool of people who think we spent too much on furlough. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. We all like to be judgmental about things which happened in the past and think we could all do a better job. The truth of the matter is we probably couldn't have done a better job, because if we look at where the United Kingdom fell in the COVID league tables of similar countries in Europe, whether or not that is France, Spain, Germany or Italy, all of those countries performed pretty similarly when it comes to the amount of people who died and the amount of excess deaths and the vaccine rollouts and so on and so forth. So if all similar countries in Europe performed pretty similarly, then that probably suggests that they didn't get it, that all of them didn't get everything right and all of them didn't get everything wrong. And perhaps we should focus on the broader Whitehall machine which failed, rather than these individual personalities who actually probably have less influence than we thought.
Inside the Times today, Will Lloyd has a comment piece saying Nigel Farage's career is built on luck, not charisma. Obviously, he left the I'm a Celebrity jungle last night. He finished third in the end. We're going to talk more about this later with the showbiz journalist Ellie Phillips. But what's interesting politically, Albie, is the speculation over what he does next. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm guessing if you don't want Boris Johnson to return to frontline politics, you don't want Nigel Farage to either.
No, absolutely not. Look, Nigel is a colleague at GB News, obviously a very esteemed colleague, and I'm glad that he's done well in I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. I think it's interesting that he didn't win, and I think people should take that as a massive hint. He came third. That means he did as well as Matt Hancock did last year, and no one is calling for Matt Hancock to come back into frontline politics. Look, I think this has certainly raised his star. It's given him a bit more cachet in the political and in the media world, and I'm sure he will milk it for all it's worth, and I congratulate him on all of his success. But I do not think it would be right for Nigel Farage to be admitted into the Conservative Party, for example, as some people are saying. This is someone who's campaigned against the Conservative Party for the last 30 years. He was a figure that was deemed to be too divisive to front the Vote Leave campaign. That's not to say he doesn't have his positives. He does have a lot of charisma. I don't agree with this assessment that everything is due to luck. Obviously, he's made some of his own luck, but I do not think he should be considered to be a future party leader of the Conservative Party. I think that is just bonkers nonsense.
And just finally, Albie, great piece in the Times too today about how to survive the office Christmas party with a whole list of do's and don'ts. For example, they say do overdress, don't go to anything that has an official photographer, do snog, don't turn up empty-handed, don't ask the next morning, and do tell everyone they look lovely. Do you love or hate the office Christmas party, Albie?
I love the office Christmas party. You're talking to someone who is at the beginning of the second week of many Christmas parties for various
How many are you going
to? I think I've got something every day this week, and I had something most days last week. I actually went to bed at 7:00 on Friday night because I was so tired from the week that I had had. So I'm right in the thick of it, but I love it. I mean, it's only 2 weeks of the year. So this is probably the last big week, really, of office Christmas parties before people start going back home for Christmas, maybe going abroad for Christmas. So this is really the big week, and I'm looking forward to it. So I think a lot of the advice in this article I will be heeding.
I'm telling you, if you want to go down a store, meet your next Christmas party, wear the 2023 Houses of Parliament Christmas jumper.
I was admiring your Christmas jumper, James. On Twitter, I actually wanted to order one. I thought I might wear it on air, but that was very quickly slapped down. So I will buy one, but you won't see it on a television screen. Perhaps you'll see it on my Twitter feed, so we can be twins, jumper twins.
Oh, lovely. They do a different one every year. I think it might have to be an annual thing for me now. Albie, great to chat. Thank you so much. Albie Amankona, political commentator and co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism, with a look at this morning's papers.